All right, I want to welcome everybody to our Charlotte area SharePoint user group meetup, May 26, 2022. My name is Andy, and I'm going to be facilitating things here today. If you are new to the Charlotte area SharePoint user group, welcome. We have our monthly meetup, usually the third or fourth Thursday, depending on when we can get a speaker each month. And just want to welcome you to this month's meetup. You can reach out to us on a bunch of different channels. We're on Meetup, casug.org. That's casug.org. Really easy to find us there. That's where we announce all of our upcoming meetings, presentations, and we have conversations and collaboration there. But we're also social media as well. You'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. We even have a Yammer community, but there's not a lot of activity in there anymore. Most of it's going through Meetup and some of our other social media. So feel free to follow us, connect with us on those various social media platforms. Speaking of social media, we do record our monthly meetings. We try to pass this information on, make it available for people that weren't able to attend. Also make the recording available for those of you that were able to attend so you can go back and review what we went over in the meeting. So with that, we have our YouTube channel. We have a number of followers on there now, so feel free to join us over on YouTube, bit.ly/CASICYT. But also just search for Charlotte Area SharePoint User Group. We have a vanity URL now because we've hit that number of subscribers where we can actually do that. This is a great way to go back and review some of our previous presentations. Also, the comments are pretty active, so you can ask questions there. And we're working on just growing the community through YouTube. I think 2 years of being virtual and online, we've learned a whole lot. Some of our members, like Daniel Christian, have really large followings, and we're trying to grow this channel to do the same thing. So engage with us over there, subscribe, and hopefully you like the videos. That being said, I will tell you the last few videos, the number of views and the engagement has gone up significantly. So that's really, really cool. So for those of you that are following along over there, really appreciate it. But tell your friends and get them to join in too. So with that, today we are here to talk about getting started with Power Automate expressions. So this talk is actually derived from another MVP friend of mine, Scott Shear, out of the Washington, D.C. area. Scott and I co-present a workshop at 365 EduCon on Power Automate. And one of the sessions in that workshop, one of the modules is Power Automate expressions. I got to lead this module the last time that we presented this in Seattle a few weeks ago rather. And I was really excited because I think I finally cracked the nut on how to present it in a way that's approachable and easy for people to get started with. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So this is a great tool for productivity. With Power Automate, you can work with personal productivity, daily team activities, and you can work with enterprise activities. And those are really the three levels. I use it a lot for personal productivity and daily team-based activities. We're creating workflows with Power Automate though, and for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. You have an event that kicks off your workflow, like a trigger. You have a set of actions. That's a unit of work that the workflow can use. So for example, based off of a connector in SharePoint, you might be able to work within a, 1 second. All right, so you have actions that are specific to your connector. So in SharePoint, you might be able to get items in a list. You might be able to get properties related to a file. You might be able to determine when an item was created versus when an item is modified. You can copy a file from one place to another. So there's actions, there's a unit of work, and the connectors determine the actions that are available. And then there are things like conditions, and that allows us to apply logic to the workflow. So based off of conditions, we can execute a set of actions, or we can execute a set of actions only when a condition evaluates to true. But as you start working in this and you start working with the 680 some odd data sources and you start working with all the triggers and actions and conditions, at some point you're going to run into the dynamic content editor, and in there you're going to run into expressions. And expressions, once you get a little bit of experience in Power Automate, can take your workflows to the next level. Expressions have a whole lot of power, but they can also really optimize your workflow and do some really cool things. So I just wanted to talk in this session this month about expressions and how to get started with them and to make them approachable and easy and hopefully get you excited about expressions. I know that's a big ask, but really to give you a foundation to build off of. So some of the things that I want to do in this session today, I want to talk about things like basic expressions, just a couple of like really easy things that you can do to get started, some nuances there, but also some tips and tricks to like work with the user interface and make it work for you. From there, we're going to talk about filtering data from lists. I'm going to be using SharePoint lists as the primary source for this. We're going to talk about composing, what compose is versus like a variable, talk about how you can test and debug as you go along, talk about things that we can do with expressions that maybe eliminate the need for conditional controls in our workflow that can also make this much more efficient. We're going to talk about formatting dates because you can't talk about workflows, Power Automate and Flow without talking about dates and UTC and the formatting there. And then time permitting, we'll build up into some more complex examples. So just a couple things to baseline off of as we get started. Performance profiles. This is from Microsoft's documentation, pulled this last night, so it should be the latest and greatest. Your flow will have limits depending on its performance profile, low, medium, and high. So that's basically tied into your licensing, and that's the license that the owner or creator of the flow has. So with that in mind, because I'm going to be demoing in a Microsoft 365 based plan, I'm going to be in the performance profile listed as low. So that's the free flow plans. That's the Microsoft 365 plans tied into like an E1, an E3, an E5 license, an A1, and so forth. Also, your Power Apps Plan 1, Power Automate Plan 1, it's going to be tied into that. There's medium and high profiles. They're going to have different licensing associated with them, so different limits are going to apply as well. So what does that performance profile mean? That means the limit, what I can actually do with my workflow. So I've established I'm on a Microsoft 365 E3, E5 license. That puts me in the low performance profile. So that means when I start doing things like working with concurrency, running actions at the same time versus sequentially, when I start working with looping, iterating through like an array, when I start working with like debatching limits, I'm going to have certain limitations based off of that low profile. So for instance, I know it's a little small, but like if I'm looking at like pagination items, it's 5,000 for low. So what does that mean? That means there's a default limit to the number of items that I can return from a SharePoint list if I do a get items action. So if I have a list of like tens of thousands of items, it's only going to give me 100 to start off with. But if I turn on the pagination, I can go up to 5,000 items based off of the low profile or performance profile. So I'll kind of refer back to some of this as I'm moving through this. I know there's a question, will the slideshow be available for download? Absolutely, I'll make this available. I'll put it in Meetup, or I'll put a link to it in Meetup so you can get to it from there and some of these limits and other notes that I have. And then, as Will's pointing out, one thing to note, depending on the type of data connection that you're working with, there's also connectors that have premium licensing associated with it. So there are a bunch of data connectors. There's like 682 and counting that you can work with, but some of those have a premium designation on that, and you have to have a different plan, like a per user plan for some of that. So licensing is a little tricky. I am not a licensing expert. I know enough to be dangerous, but we'll make sure we reference some of that as well. So with that, I'm going to switch gears. I'm actually going to move over to my desktop, share my desktop, and I'm going to start actually demoing from over there. So give me 1 second to switch that up. All right, so I'm sharing my screen. You should be able to see this. Looks like it's coming through. So I'm going to pick up with basic expressions. These are some simple things that you can start off with to kind of baseline and get things going. If you're familiar with the syntax that's you use for Excel-based expressions, it's basically going to be the same thing here. It's the Excel IntelliSense-based expression format. That's what we're going to be working with here. So I have an example of a basic expression. It looks really complicated, but it's actually not. When you break it down, it's actually pretty straightforward. So this is a concatenate, which means I'm going to take a couple of different strings and I'm going to combine them together. So in this concatenate, I actually have a string. I have a string, and both of these are dynamic, meaning I'm pulling something, in this case, a variable. So I'm pulling that from another action. And then I've got a string that ties it together, and this one's actually really simple. It's a dash, and I put the dash between a single quote. So by doing this, what I would actually be able to do is maybe I would be able to output something, in this case, like I would have maybe a ID that references a product dash, and then I would have like maybe the year associated with that. And that's what this would actually output. Now, this one's dynamic because I'm using variables. So meaning this product ID could change. So it could be, I could have like a whole bunch of different products, and then like, maybe keep the year the same. Or I might even run into a situation where like I have a whole bunch of different products and like we move into a new fiscal year. And so it, based off of the variable, it updates automatically for me. But at the core, this is actually pretty straightforward and um, pretty simple to work with. So like I'm using a function called concatenate to combine a couple of different strings together. So let's actually take a look at this in um, a live demo. All right, so I'm going to head over. I'm in Power Automate, and I'm going to go in. I'm going to create a new flow. And this is one of the first things I want to touch base on about kind of debugging and working. But I'm going to do an instant cloud flow. And the reason I'm going to do an instant cloud flow is because I can push a button and I can make things start to happen right away. All right, so I'm going to do an instant cloud flow, and I'm going to manually trigger a flow. So when you're first starting out and you're learning some of this stuff, this is actually a really helpful way to do it. So I'm going to manually trigger a flow. Now, the cool thing about that is when you expand this trigger, you can add an input. So this kind of, it's going to create a little form for me, and the form's going to allow me to enter data, and then I can get an output based off of the inputs that I create. So I'm going to use this as a way to do just a simple baselining action. All right, so I'm going to add an input here. I'm going to do just a number field, and we'll call this number 1 just to keep it straightforward. And then I'm going to go down here. I'm going to add another input. I'm going to do another number field. I'm going to call this one number 2. All right, so I got numbers 1 and 2. That's what I want to work with. So when I go to manually trigger this flow in just a minute, I'm going to be able to input values into that and get something out of it. Now I'm going to rename this real quick, just so I know. This is expressions basic demo. All right, and then the next thing I want to do is based off of this, I want some kind of output. Like I'm going to input information here, and then I want to do something with it. So I'm going to go down here and add a new step, and I'm going to choose another operation. And what I'm looking for is the compose action. It's pretty straightforward. It's called a data. The grouping is data operation, but I'm going to go in, I'm going to select compose. All right, so that's going to allow me to get an input. Now, if I just place my mouse inside of here, it's going to allow me to do a dynamic content lookup for the manually trigger flow. So you're going to see all this information down here. So like I scroll through, I see like username, email, date, and so forth. Like, so I see all this information down here. So there's my number 1. All right, so there it's there. And then wait, maybe we do a plus sign and number 2. So I'm going to output based off of that. So let's save this. All right, so it's saving. All right, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to test it. I'm going to click a manual or manually test this, and then I'm going to go and click the test button. So it's going to pop up and it's going to say, well, enter a number in for 1. So I'm going to, or for the first number. So I'm going to say 2. Then I'll go down and I'll enter 2 for this next one. I'm going to run the flow. All right, so it says the flow ran successfully. Go to the flow runs page. So I'm going to click on that link. I'm going to open it up. It's going to open this in a new tab. All right, so it says that the test was successful. So let's actually go and view the outcome of that and see what actually happened. All right, so we manually triggered the flow. It tells me the inputs. So it shows me all this information that it collected. And if I view like the raw inputs, it gives it to me in like a JSON, and so I can see like what was what was there, and the outputs show me number one it collected 2, and number 2 it collected 2, which is exactly what I wanted. All right, so let's go and expand the compose. Take a look at that, and then this is what it's telling me. It got 2 plus 2, so it outputted 2 plus 2. It didn't add it together. It basically gave it to me in a text string. That's not what I intended. And so I just wanted to show that. I have to use a function or a formula in order for it to give me the output that I want. So I know we're starting level 100 here, but that's the basic. Like I can't just go in and say, well, take this, put some operator in it, and give me this other number and output it as something. I have to tell it how to use an expression or maybe a formula in order to do that. So what I'm going to do is place my cursor here in the compose, and rather than doing the dynamic content, I'm going to click on expression. And so an expression is going to allow me to do things like string functions, collections, logical functions like if statements or equals and or. It's going to allow me to do conversions. It's going to allow me to do math-based functions as well, date and time-based functions. So the cool thing about this is in this little FX editor right here. This is where I do all of my editing. I could just start typing. So if I know I want to do something like add or sum, I could just start typing that in, and it's going to say, oh, did you want to add? And that's actually a math function. So like if I scroll down, I'll see that underneath the math section. It'll say, where is math? Maybe I passed it. No, it'll say like underneath math, it'll say like add. So let me just go down. There it is. So there's math, and then it says add. And this returns the result of adding two numbers. And so it's add, open, close parentheses, and then in between that, first value and second value separated by a comma. So I just need to do the same thing here. So I'm going to insert my parentheses. And when I did that, it gave me this little pop-up, and it's like, here's the formula that you use. Add, first thing that you want, comma, second thing that you want, and then it'll return the results from that. Now, with the expression editor that I have here, I can actually go back to the dynamic content editor and reference things that I've already got. So like if I click on dynamic content, oh, now it's saying, hey, you're doing this function. Let's go ahead and narrow it down to the dynamic content that this function can actually use. So that's really handy. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to say number 1. I'm going to add a comma because I know my formula is value, comma, value, and then I'm going to add my number 2. And so it's going to output this right here, add, and it's going to say like trigger body number 1 separated with a comma. Now I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to click OK. Now I'm copying it because I'm going to show you something in just a second to go along with that, but I'm going to click OK. All right, so now I've got this formula in here. Now this is where things get a little bit frustrating when you're working with this. I've got this compose and I've got this action. It tells me, okay, this is a function. That's what fx means. And it tells me add ... but it doesn't tell me a whole lot. So if I hover over that with my mouse cursor, it starts to give me a little information. It's kind of hard to see. It's a little small, but it tells me trigger body number, comma, trigger body number 1. And I know what that refers to. That's the dynamic content for number, the 2 numbers that I created. So here's a pro tip for you. Go to the action that you're working with and go to the ... in the upper corner. Call this the meatball menu. Click on the meatball menu and go in and add a note. And in that note, paste your formula. And now when you go back to this action, there's the formula that you're using, and you don't have to do the little hover over thing and get it in that really small font. You can see it right there and you can reference it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to actually test it. All right, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to click the test button. I'm going to manually perform this. All right, so the form's going to pop up. It's going to ask me enter number 1. So I'm going to say 3 and 4. All right, so I want to add 3 and 4 together, and then I'm going to go and run that flow. All right, so it says it's done. I'm going to go to the flow runs page and verify that. All right, so most recent is at the top. Tested successfully. Let's click on that and let's go and view the outcome. All right, so I entered in 3 and 4. I can see that there. And then if I go to the compose action, it's telling me that it outputted that as 7. So my, in this case, my compose action worked, and that's it's outputting exactly how I wanted. So I'm going to go back to the flow because there's just a couple of things I want to baseline on. All right, so when you're learning this, create a simple flow just like I did here. Do a manual trigger and then just do like a simple compose and start playing with actions just to see our functions, to see what they're going to do, to see how to line up the syntax, to how they tie into your dynamic lookups. You can create a whole bunch of little test workflows like this, and you can work through how to use this or how to get a certain output, and you can do it in the context here without having to worry about like building it within the context of a larger flow. You can test it out here, get your foundation, and then go apply it to that larger flow a little bit later on. And I see someone's like, thanks for the note tip. All credit due to Scott. Scott taught me that, Scott Shear. That it's super handy. I'm a big fan of it. Once he taught it to me, I was like, well, I'll be using that in every flow that I use moving forward. But you're not just limited to like putting in the formula. You can also give yourself a note what you were thinking or what you were referencing there. So, all right, so that's a basic one that I wanted to start off with. So that one kind of gets us started in the process. All right, so let's do another expression basic demo. So I'm going to go to flow, and I'm just going to do another instant cloud flow. All right, so this is going to be actually, what did I name the other one? Hold on one second. I want to, all right, expressions basic demo. So the next one will be expressions basic demo 2. All right, so let's go ahead and create that. I've already got a name for it. I'm going to do something similar here. I'm going to add an input. I'm going to do text. And so for the first input, I'm going to do like first name, do the next input. And this one, pretty straightforward. Last name. So please enter your values. And if you're probably already thinking ahead of me, want to combine those into a full name. So I'm going to go to the next step here, and I'm just going to do a compose action again. So compose. All right, so we're going to do our input here. So this one's going to be a little bit different. I don't want to add the things together. I'm not working with numbers. In this case, I want to bring 2 text strings together. And that's what these are. These are strings. So I want to bring 2 strings together. So I need to use a different expression for that. So this one, I'm going to go and do a concatenate. It's a string function, combines any number of strings together. So text 1, text 2, text 3, and so forth. All right, so I'm going to do a concat here. All right, so I'm already requesting the first name and last name when I manually trigger this flow. So with concat highlighted, I'm going to go back to dynamic content, drop in, and I want first name. And I know I need to separate these with commas, so I'm going to enter in a comma, and then I'm going to do last name. All right, once again, I'm going to just copy that. All right, I'm going to say OK. I'm going to go to my notes, verify that, and text 1. All right, everything should be good there. All right, I'm going to save it. Let's go in and test it. I'm going to do this manually. All right, so first name, Tony, last name, Stark. Let's go ahead and run that. All right, so we've got an output, so let's go. Let's actually view that. We're in our run history. Click on the flow run itself. We'll see Tony Stark. That's what we inputted, and the output, it's given me Tony Stark, but no spaces in between it because I told it to combine, concatenate 2 strings together. So that just tells me that I need to go and I need to add another input or string input into this. All right, so let's just make an adjustment to that. All right, so I'm going to go back to my flow. I'm going to go back to the concatenate action. And what I want to do is between the first, it's called trigger body text. So that's the first name, comma, and then it's got trigger body text one. That's the second text field. What I want to do is where that comma is, I want to add a text string in between those two. So I'm going to do a single quote, I'm going to do a space, I'm going to do a single quote, and then I'm going to put a comma to separate that. So now I've got text one, text two, and text three. The editor up here is telling me that. All right, I'm going to just copy all that. I'm going to update it, and then I'm just going to update my note here. All right, so there's the note. All right, so I'll update that. We'll save it, and what should happen is because I've inserted a string to set a single quotes, and whatever I put between that becomes a text string. Now I should have a space or a separator in there. Now I'm going to go and test this, but rather than doing this manually like I just did, let's try to do it automatically with a recently used trigger. I ran this a minute ago, so I can just use the same data from before. So this is a really helpful trick. You don't have to enter in the same data over and over and over. All right, so I'm going to click on this. I'm going to go ahead and test. It should run pretty quickly. And if I view the outcome of the compose, there's my value. Now I have that name. And because I put that other string with just a space in it, now I've got Tony space Stark. So now I've got a full name based off of the two text inputs. So that's how you can use concatenate, and you can manipulate a text string. So now you've got a pretty powerful set of basics to start off with. We've seen we can use a function and reference dynamic content, and we've seen how you can use a function and also manipulate the outcome by adding to that. And the formula editor kind of gives you some hints as to what you can do along the way. All right, so there's a couple of comments in the chat window. I just want to make sure that for the video, those are being kind of brought out. Will says he finds it handy to keep a text editor open to copy and paste expressions back and forth because it's hard to see everything in the editor. I do agree. That's also why I like using the note thing. The only thing about copying and pasting back and forth is if you're going to use an editor, like Will says, Notepad++, if you have a text editor and it supports rich content, it will mess up those single quotes. It'll put the wrong kind of single quote in the formula, and the formula won't work if you're like copying and pasting back and forth. So just a note there. But yeah, Notepad++ will help with some of that. And putting it in a bigger screen can definitely help, but I really like the notes thing. All right, so that's kind of getting us started. Those are a couple of like basic things that we can kind of do. Now let's start to go a little bit deeper. Some other types of expressions that we can work with. I'm going to show you this one, the inventory ID, and then I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to build it. But that's also going to start to build up into formatting and working with dates. All right, so let me go ahead and open this one up. All right, this one is going to be a manually triggered flow. I've got it connected to a list, and I'll show you the list in a minute. But in that list, I go and select an item. And when I select that item, I can manually trigger the flow to run. So this one's going to actually, for that item, start to do something. So when I do, in this case, I'm doing the trigger for a selected item, I have to point it to the site and to the list that I want it to connect to. Then I have to tell it to get the item's information. So go for this item, this is where I'm triggering it, get all the information, all the columns and metadata associated with that item. Now, once I have that, the next thing is, in this case, I'm going to start to initialize a variable. So compose and variable, what's the difference? A variable can be modified, but it only works within the context of the flow run. So a variable is something that we initialize, and then we can append or increment or de-increment. We can modify the variable somehow. Through functions and formulas and other data, the variable can be modified, but it only works in this flow run. Think of the flow as a cycle. So within this cycle, we can use it. Compose, on the other hand, locks us into that value. compose can't be modified after we gather that thing and we put it in the compose block. It's locked in. So using the combination of the two, we can initialize a variable and then we can compose and lock in an outcome. Now, I like using variables, and I like using variables as high up in my workflow as I can, because that gives me the ability to go back and reuse that value multiple times throughout that workflow. So like I can compose or initialize a variable and then call it and use it a whole bunch of times in a workflow, and I don't have to repeat the same information over and over. I can generate it once and call it whenever I need it. But when you start working with that, it's very important that you name your actions. So you need to rename your actions. So like here, I'm saying initialize variable, and I'm going to say like fiscal year, so that I can clearly identify this in the dynamic lookup later on. Also, when you name a variable, you'll find that a lot of people in the Power Platform community name their variables var in lowercase, and then the name of the variable in camel case immediately after that. So mine, I'm saying is var year, and I'm capitalizing year. So I know this is a variable, and then this is the year that I'm referencing. Camel case just means you remove spaces and you capitalize the first letter of the next word, so it's got the humps in it as you read it. All right, so I'm doing a variable name year, and then fiscal year, and then I'm going to compose something. Now you see I've already started to create a formula inside of here. So let's actually build one of these from like scratch and show you a couple of ins and outs with this. All right, so I'm going to go back. I'm just going to do a new flow. And just for the simplicity's sake, I'm just going to do a manually triggered one again. So this will be Expression Basics Demo 3 and create. All right, so I'm just going to manually trigger this one. And I'm going to do a new step, and then I want to do a variable. All right, so variable, and you see there's a whole bunch of different variable actions. Append to an array, append to a string, decrement, increment, initialize, and set variable. The first thing I need to do is initialize my variable. I have to create the storage container. All right, so I'm going to do variable, and I'm just going to say var, and I'm going to call this one year. Now there are different variable types: Boolean, like a true false, integers, floats, strings, objects, and array. For this one, I'm going to keep it pretty basic, and I'm going to do a string. But you could, like, if you did an array, you could create like a table of values, which is pretty powerful. All right, so I'm going to do a string, and then it's asking for an initial value. All right, so I can go ahead and set the value right here, and then I can reference it later. So I could go and say like 2022. If I do that, though, I'm hard coding 2022 into this, which means I would have to use this 2022 for all these workflows. And then later on, 2023, or when we go to fiscal 2023, I might have to update it. So I don't want to do that. So what I can do is I can use an expression. So I can go to my expression editor, and I'm going to do one. And I'm going to call this one second. All right. All right. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to format, and I want to format date and time. All right. So I'm going to start building this, and I'm going to format date and time, open and close. And it tells me, okay, format your date and time, timestamp, and then whatever you need. So I need a little bit more information. Like, how does it know what the year is? Well, I could do like a dynamic lookup. So like if I had dynamic content, like for example, let me go back to the other flow for a second. All right, so this is the one I was basing this off of. Let's just go back. All right, so if I go and I look at this one, I formatted the date and time. Well, let's expand that and let's actually view it. And what I'm referencing here is UTC now. But if I go to the dynamic content and I look there, I might have things like when this was created, like when the item was created. There might be a modified field when this particular thing was modified, or maybe the item has its own date and time field. So I can do a dynamic lookup and I can actually format that if I need to. But I'm going to do this UTC now, just like you see here and show you this in the formula. So we'll go back to our expression editor. We're going to format date and time. And in that set of parentheses, I want to do UTC now. Now I'm doing a whole bunch of typing here because this saves you a bunch of time once you get familiar with it. So I'm going to do UTC now, and then I have to tell it, well, how do you want to format this? Like you're telling me the value UTC now, but how do you want to output this? Like what's the next thing? So I'm going to do that in a second. What is UTC now? If you're getting started with Power Automate and you're working with dates and times, you need to be familiar with UTC now because the system is based off of UTC now, and you might have to do a conversion from UTC to your time zone. So we're Eastern Daylight Time in the U.S. At this 5 or 8 hours off of UTC. So what I have to do is I have to reference, or I have to format or convert from UTC time to current time. There's actually a specific action for that. So you got like date and time, and then you can convert your time zone. So you can say like time to convert. So find the base time, and then you can switch it over, and you see it's like UTC. So you would scroll through until you found, in my case, like Eastern Standard Time, wherever that happens to be, and it's 5 hours. So Eastern Standard Time here, 5 hours. So there are actions that do some of this for you, but if you're building out like a function, then you might have to actually manually do this. All right, so I'm going to say UTC now, and then I'm going to do what format, like how do I want to output this. Now there's a whole reference from Microsoft on this, like how to format this in the proper way. Let me just see if I can find that real quick. I don't know if I have it open in this tab or not, but I'll make sure you get a reference to that. But it tells you like how do you reference like date and time. And so what you can do is in single quotes, you could do like if you wanted it in a 4, like 2022, you enter 4 Ys. In my case, maybe I just want 2. All right, so I'm going to do single quote YY single quote, and we'll say okay. All right, so this is the formula that it's going to give me, and I'll do my best practice. We'll go in, add a note to that. All right, and I'm going to delete this action. All right, and so what I want to do now is I want to test this. So we're going to save it. Everything's good. Go in and test it. I'll just do this manually because I haven't ran this one yet. There's nothing to input because I'm just running it. So you can actually have blank inputs on this, and then you can actually see the results. And so if I go and look at the results of this, and I'm just going to expand the initialized variable, now it's outputting 22. So it gave me the last 2 digits of the year. So by doing this, I've now got a string where I'm outputting the last 2 digits of the year based off of the UTC time. So it's going to automatically update this for me every flow that I run based off of this moving forward. Super helpful. So now that I've got that variable, the next step is just to compose the action that's going to give me the next part of this. So I was doing an inventory ID here, meaning maybe we're taking an ID of something, and then we're appending a fiscal year to that to create a unique identifier for that item, maybe inside of a list. So now that I've shown you how to do the output of this, format UTC, grab the year, and Will was kind enough to find the article for the date and strings. Thank you, Will. It's always good having a co-pilot. Yep, here you go, standard date and format time strings. So thanks, Will. We'll make sure we get that out. You can see here's some of the references and how you can use this. Have this open, keep this in another tab. Super helpful for when you're developing these workflows. All right, so with that, going back, I've set my variable, and then I'm going to do a compose action. And in the compose, for this particular thing, I'm just doing another concatenate. So if we look at the concatenate, and I'll grab all of this, we'll drop it in our notes so we can see it. I am concatenating something from the list, and I'm appending a space, and I'm adding the variable year to the end of that. So this is what it looks like in practice. All right, so I'll just test this based off of a run that I ran last night in testing. I'll show you what the outcome looks like. All right. So it's initializing a variable, it's grabbing the last two digits of the current year, and then it's composing, and it's taking an input, and in this case, an ID of something, and it's outputting. So it's giving me the item's ID, space, and then it's giving me 2022. I'm going to make an edit to this. I'm going to go back to the concatenate, and where it's got the space part in it, so it's got a single quote and a space. I'm going to go in, I'm going to replace that. I'm going to put a dash in there. I'm going to update that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and save that. Pretty straightforward. All right, and now I'm going to go and run this again, but I'm going to run it from the list that this is connected to. So I'm going to go to the list. So here's the list. I'm going to select item number 5. All right, and with that selected, I'm going to go to the automate dropdown. I'm going to wait for it to update, and there's my inventory ID year workflow. And this is just like manually running for a selected item. In this case, it's IN0005. I'm going to run the flow. All right, and I'm going to head back to Power Automate. I've got a run just happened. I'm going to open that up and review it. Variable, it's giving me the right year. And then if I look at the compose, IN0005-22. So now I have a unique identifier for this thing. And it's pending that with the fiscal year. I get this one all the time. So I use this a lot to initialize maybe a prefix ID, like a 3-digit prefix set of text characters. And then on the back end of it, a fiscal year. So now I have 3 pieces of metadata. I have the 3-digit prefix ID. I have the actual ID of the thing. And then I have on the back end the fiscal year, and that tells me a lot of information about that particular resource. Now, as I mentioned, I use this a lot because there's actually a hidden field when you start working with getting items. There's an ID field. Everything has an ID associated with it. And so I can use the default SharePoint ID and append that with my prefix ID and the post fiscal year, and I get a really cool unique identifier, and the user never has to input it. The way that I bring that all back together is you add one more action to your workflow. In this case, I'm going to do SharePoint, and what I want to do is in SharePoint, I want to update the item. And so what I can then do is I can tell it the thing that I want to update. So I'm going to go to the Certification Village site. I'm going to do my inventory list, the ID of the thing that started all this off. And then if I had a field down here for inventory ID, I could update that with the output of my compose action. And so the next time that this workflow ran, it would actually update and it would append that item with that that unique identifier. All right, so that's a couple things that are a little more advanced. All right, so I got some more things I want to go into. So we're getting into some more string-based stuff. Now, I might have to do a part 2 on this because I realize we're 40 minutes into it, and I still have a bunch of things I want to talk about. So the next thing I want to go into is filtering data from a list. We're going to get into expressions there. Specifically, we're going to get into filter queries, but we're also going to get into working with pagination and then trigger-based queries as well. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this, and I'll just do this from a demo. All right, so filtering a list. When we create a flow and we run it through a list, there's an initial limit on based off of the flow license that I have. We've established that I'm in the low category. The default is it's only going to return the first 100 items. but I can adjust my flow and I can make it give me more information. All right, so let's go back to this flow and I've got filter my list. Let's open this one up. All right, so manually trigger flow, and then I wanted to go and get items. So I'm going to that same list to get items. If you go to the dot, dot, dot in the upper corner and you go into settings, you've got this thing called pagination. This allows you to modify the threshold for the number of things that you're going to return back from that particular flow. So in this case, I'm going to turn it on and I'm going to say, well, I want 5,000 items. That's my upper limit. The default's 100. Now I want you to go and find 1,000 items for this thing. All right, so if I go and loop through and I say get items, it should give me all the items in that particular list. Now here's where it's kind of fun. How to like I could go through, like I'll save this and I'll show you the output of this. All right, so I'll just test this manually. And I'm going to run that. So go through and give me everything. All right, so it's going to go through and ran successfully. All right, so the flow was triggered and then it got a whole bunch of stuff. Click to download. Well, I can't read that. I'm sure Will can. I can't read that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste that. And I'm going to go to Visual Studio Online. This is vscode.dev. You can go here for free. It's pretty cool. All right. So in vscode.dev, I'm going to go and I'm going to create a new file. And I just have to, give it a name. And then it's going to say, well, what language are you working with? Spoiler alert, select the language, JSON. It will automatically identify that, but I'm going to do JSON and I'm going to paste in all that information. All right, so it puts all that in there and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to format it. Now it's formatted and you see along the right hand side, this is a really long document. But if I scroll through here, there's item 25. Keep going, I'm going to run into there's item 24 right there. So it did find, spoiler, all 25 items in my list. So it did actually go and get everything from the list. But I wanted to show you this because this is helpful for debugging as well. Use VS Code and you can go and see the actual outputs that are coming back from whatever you've done in the workflow. I use this all the time for debugging processes. But there's another way that I can simplify all this stuff. What did I get from that workflow? I'm going to go back to here, and this is the one I was working with. So I said get items. Well, I'm going to go and I'm going to do a new step, and I'm going to use my compose action. And with compose, I'm going to do a formula. I'm going to say length. And what I want is the length, and I'm going to do a dynamic lookup, and I'm going to say the list of the value from the get items. So give me that information. All right, and I'll save that, and then I'll just test it. And I'll just use the data from the last run. And it'll output. There's my compose. And in this case, it got 21 items. So it didn't get all 25, it got 21. I got something else going on in this list I'll show you in just a second. But using the compose in this situation is really helpful for debugging. How many items am I actually getting back from this thing? So how items are actually being returned from this particular action? You can output that and use a length formula for it. And that's actually really helpful, especially if you're troubleshooting. All right, so next up, and I'm going back to the PowerPoint for just a second. So there's when we start getting information, we just determined I had 25 items, but I only returned the compose action only returned 21. So what's happening? Well, there's some queries going on. So with the 5,000 item limit, one thing that you can actually do is when you get your items, you can do a filter query and you can filter out the null values. So if there's like a field that has a null value that you don't want to return, you can eliminate that entirely from from what it pulls down. So in my case, if I go and look at the list, I'm looking for the reorder date field. So based off of the reorder date field in my list, reorder date, you see some of these are blank. So if there's no reorder date, maybe the item is flagged for deletion. I don't need to return that. So that's why it only returned 21 items. I'm running a filter on it. The filter helps me to narrow down the scope. But I wanted to show you the null for one specific reason. A lot of times when we're working with a query, for instance, we work with things like true or false. So like, for example, I have this column here called flagged items. Now, I'm going to make sure I get the internal name for that column. So this is a pro tip. I'm going to go to the list settings. This column is called flagged items to reorder. But what I need to make sure that I get is the actual internal name for that column. And in this case, it calls it field 0. That's not the display name at all. So field 0 is the internal column name. I get that through the settings. And then I go back and I can say, well, I want this thing, and I need to do an OData filter operator. Looks like Will has already made that reference in the chat window. Everything you ever wanted to know about filter queries, including the OData operators. So I know in this case EQ means equals, and then I have to tell it what I want to compare it to. If I just type in the word true, this should give me an error. So what I actually need to do is go into the expression editor and type in the word true. And then it actually does true. But the exception to that is this null thing. Technically, yes, I can go to the expression editor and I can do this thing called null. But for some reason, in the OData filter query, it does not like that. This is the one case where you can type in the word null and it'll actually filter that out. But anytime you have to reference like true or false, you're going to have to go to the expression editor, enter that in, and then it'll use that moving forward. So in my case, we are filtering out null values. So if this column uh, is not equal to null, give me all of those values back. All right. So in this case, the reason I'm getting 21 items back is because it's filtering out those null values. So using a filter query can allow me to eliminate blank values that might cause an error in another formula, or it can allow me to narrow down that data to get exactly what I want. And when you're doing the filter queries, you can use like and or statements inside of there, and you can manipulate what you're querying to get to a subset of that data with to get to a subset of the data so that you can get underneath like that threshold that you might have to work around for a workflow. So that's something else you can do when you're working with information. Narrow it down to just what you need and use that. And in this case, an expression, OData expression, can actually help you with that. Now, I know we're pretty close to time, so I'm going to reach a stopping point in a minute, but I'm going to go up here, and there's one other thing that you can do that's really crazy, but it's really helpful. In your settings, there's actually, let me go over here. I got another flow where this is set up. So in your settings, we can do a trigger condition. And the trigger condition saves you flow runs, and it only runs when that condition is met. So I have an action, or a trigger rather, an event to kick off this workflow. When an item is created or modified in this particular list, do something. But in the settings, I'm using a trigger condition where I'm looking for a certain field to be equal to true. So in this particular case, I'm looking for a field where the flagged items is equal to true. So if I try to run this on an item where it's not true, so like this is item number 5, so let's try to like maybe modify this. Let's change the unit price. All right, and if I go back to that flow and I view the flow run, and you'll see it's not running right now because the trigger condition didn't allow it to pass into the flow. So if I go back and I make a change to this and I say that flagged item is set to yes, and then we change that value. So let's say it's 80. In a second, I should get a new flow run 4 seconds ago, and you'll see that the flow actually ran successfully, and it's based off of the trigger condition. So the trigger condition can be used to run only when that condition is met. That saves you flow runs. So we can narrow down to that specific condition. Now the syntax is a little crazy. You have to do an @ sign, and then you have to tell it the operator that you want to work with. So here's a tip for that. Start your flow, compose, and in this case, like I was composing just based off of the inventory ID. And then I did a variable. And the variable in this case, I was looking for the trigger body, Boolean, and then equals. And specifically, I'm looking for that particular field. So like I built it here as just a standalone thing. So I'm saying look for that particular field. And if it evaluates to, if it equals true, that's what I want. And then I just copied all of this right here, went back to my trigger action or condition, I pasted it in, and then just added an @ sign at the beginning. And because my expression was evaluated using the expression was valid based off of working in this action down here, I know that it works up that it'll work at the trigger condition. I just need to append that with an @ sign at the beginning. So I can use that as a way to create a condition where now I can filter out null values. I can run a query on information. I can do pagination to increase the amount of information that I'm returning. And I can run a trigger condition to do something else that's even more powerful. So we saw, I did a reference here for some of the OData stuff. Will provided a couple of other references to that. So thank you for sending that over, Will. I demoed the compose and the outputs there. That's just in the PowerPoint. I've got some information about how to replace the condition or trigger condition expression output right here. That's in the PowerPoint, and a link to the article, and then some references for the formatting dates as well. You saw me demo a whole bunch of variables. I like doing manual stuff to kind of learn it and then go and apply it in my actual flow. But now you know the difference between initializing a variable and working with a compose action. I didn't get to the if statement, so I'll save that one for another one because we're pretty close to time. And I did do a couple of things with dates, but I think we could spend a whole hour on dates. But I did show you my little trick for formatting around like the fiscal year and how to reference that in a unique ID. I use that one all the time. And I did a couple of things around the testing and debugging all along the way. So with that, I know we are at time. Some of you have to go. I do appreciate your attention here today. If you like this one, let me know. We'll see if we can do part 1, 2, 3, however many parts that we need to do. Maybe I can get Scott to pop in and do some of this with us. I know there's probably a few questions out there. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes. I'm going to take some of those questions, have some conversation with those of you that are here. But if you're watching this video on YouTube, hope you subscribed, hope you found this helpful, and hope to see you at the next Charlotte area SharePoint user group meeting.